the figures. I thought I had them there. I don't have them, I forgot that. I'll just quote a few. According to Mark Curtis, if you want to look this up, Mark Curtis is a British historian. He's got 2 books, Unpeople and Web of Deceit, that I would strongly recommend. And he's got a list of tables at the end of his book where he does a kind of comprehensive breakdown. But my actual figure comes from a guy called J.W. Smith, he worked at the Institute for Economic Democracy in Arizona. And he says that it's about 12 to 15 million people who died from 1945 to 1990 when you calculate the direct deaths from military interventions. What he then says is that there are unknown numbers of people who died as an indirect consequence of these interventions in terms of the socio-economic policies of the regimes that were then installed. And he goes, you can only estimate these upwards of 100 million. Over 100 million is a reasonable estimate. Now this is shocking. These figures are not part of our historical consciousness. We do not identify these figures with the advance of modernity. And I think that says that there is something seriously wrong with our understanding of history. And I wanted to close by just giving a brief example of the kind of Holocaust-type events that are going on today with Iraq. We don't look at Iraq as a Holocaust. But I'm minded, just looking at the death toll figures, to think that maybe it is. Maybe this is really something which tells us there is something deeply wrong with our civilization when an event like this can be actually justified in the name of security. Now we can run through the figures there. The first figure, 150,000, was done, the study was done by a woman who worked in the US Department of Commerce. And when she produced these figures, she was fired, because they said, these figures can't be right. But she went along and she actually published them in a peer-reviewed journal. The UN sanctions regime, again, these figures are not disputed. 1.7 million civilians died. Now the fact is that one can debate over what the intent was, but it's pretty clear that the UN sanctions regime and the officials who set it up, people in the US government and the British government, they pretty much were aware of the impact of their policies. And just to give an example, from Robert Gates. Robert Gates is currently the US Defense Secretary, and he said this as Presidential National Advisor, National Security Advisor to the first Bush administration in 1991. He said, Iraqis will pay the price while Saddam is in power. And that was his reference to the impact of the sanctions regime. And the last figure is 1.2 million civilians according to OBR. Now, obviously you've probably heard of the John Hopkins University School of Public Health study, which estimated that it was about over 600,000 Iraqis had died. Now, their data set, if you extend it to today, also implies that the casualties are about 1 million. Now, what happened is that the OBR, they did a survey by interviewing, they went into Iraq and they did face-to-face interviews with Iraqis on the ground, over 1,000 of them. And they asked them how many people have died as a result of the coalition intervention. And this is how they came up with their figure. Actually, it was 1,720 adults over 18. And that was where they came up with this figure. Now, all of these are statistical studies. Now, these are scientific studies that, by normal standards, if you applied them in everyday life, would not be questioned. But when it comes to Iraq, and you look at the state of the debate in the mainstream media, these figures are not given currency. These figures are debatable. These statistical methodologies suddenly become highly questionable. And when it comes to issues like, car crashes and things like that, no, they work fine. We don't need to question them. But just so you know, the Ministry of Defense actually quietly told its officials not to criticize the John Hopkins study in public because they said the findings were robust. So they know that they're robust. the total people who died in Iraq, if you add that up, over from 1991 is 3 million people. That's half the people they're told from the Jewish Holocaust. That is shocking. So that's part 2 out of the way. That's looking at the kind of historical direct military angle. Now what I want to talk about is what is happening today. And there are 4 key areas that I want to discuss, as you can see. And what I'm going to try and do is select some of the most pertinent data, some of the most well-known data. Obviously, I'm not a physical scientist myself, but I'm going to try and select the most pertinent stuff that is least questionable from the scientific evidence on all of these issues, and try and build up a picture of what is likely to happen to the world if we do not change our current course. Starting on the issue of climate catastrophe. Now, as we know, this is an industrial civilization. But what do we mean by that? It means that we derive all our energy, essentially, from fossil fuels. Fossil fuels, the burning of fossil fuels obviously pumps carbon dioxide, CO2 into the atmosphere. And it's those CO2 emissions that are, according to the conventional scientific argument, the primary force that is driving climate change. These industries, they drive our economies, they drive our societies, they sustain our infrastructures. Yet these industries are the main engine of global warming in the last few decades. Obviously, this doesn't mean that all climate change ever is due to human-induced CO2. Scientists know that there are many other factors, including solar activity and things like that, but overwhelmingly, the scientific evidence shows that overwhelmingly it's the primary factor is CO2 emissions. Now, I want to start by, I want to kind of open this issue by mentioning, did you guys watch that Channel 4 documentary called The Great Global Warming Swindle? That was a couple of months ago. And this was a really appalling documentary because it was, it's now really been heavily criticised by climate scientists, but it was a kind of typical kind of Channel 4 propaganda job. They had set out to show that global warming was definitely a hoax, absolutely a hoax. And I want to start from this to kind of deal with the issue of whether this is really questionable or not, because it's something that people still talk about. Now this is the graph that charts the average global temperature rise. And that's the graph that they used in Channel 4. Now, just to go back, this is the original graph, and that's what they used. You can see the line there which goes down is pretty much more difficult to see in the original graph. So they basically fudged the image in order to kind of prove a point that global warming is not happening, blah, 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 blah. That there was a long cooling period. And just to hit the point home, I'll talk about the solar issue in a second. The New Scientist has another graph which charts, based on normal changes that would be going on the basis of without CO2 emissions, they've calculated, just due to solar activity, just to the periodic orbit of the Earth. The green line would show most probably